Spies and detectives. We've certainly dealt with quite a number of them over the years here at Dave White Presents. Let's see, who have we had? We've had James Bond, Agatha Christie, The Thin Man, and Roscoe P. Coltrane from the Dukes of Hazzard. All right, I'm pushing it there. Well, we had Columbo and Murder, She Wrote, and quite a number of famous detectives, but for some reason, we have yet to touch on Sherlock Holmes. Well, we're going to do that a bit today with our next guest, whose name is Jon Lellenberg. Now, for folks, if you haven't heard of him, he is the historian for an interesting group called the Baker Street Irregulars that we'll be talking about. He's the literary executor for the Conan Doyle estate here in the United States, and we really want to spend some time talking about a wonderful new novel that came out last year that's called The Baker Street Irregular, and that's what we'll be getting into, detectives and spies. So let's let Jon tell us about all these fascinating things by bringing on Jon Lellenberg. Hey, Jon, welcome to Dave White Presents.
Thanks very much, Wes. I appreciate your interest in the book.
Oh, well, absolutely. I very much loved it. And, folks, if you go to the Persons of Interest page here at the Dave White Presents webpage, you'll find Jon, and you'll find information about that book, which we'll be getting into here in a little bit, but it was very much an enjoyable read. Well, before we get to Baker Street Irregular, let's start off a bit with Sherlock Holmes, Jon. How did you get interested in that famous character?
Well, I think, like a lot of people, when I was a young boy, I saw what at the time was the first Sherlock Holmes television series in this country and was intoxicated by it and went out and got the stories and read them and became addicted over a long period of time. And this pretty much lasted until I got distracted by other things in college, but in graduate school in Los Angeles, in a bookshop one day, I spotted something that had been published the year before, and it was a huge 2-volume edition of the stories called The Annotated Sherlock Holmes by a New York, I guess a Time Life editor named William S. Baring Gould. And he was a member of the Baker Street Irregulars, which had existed since 1934 and had built up a huge body of mock scholarly literature about the stories, taking them for real, taking Holmes and Watson for historical figures, and doing a lot of research and writing to attack the contradictions, the inconsistencies, and the like in the stories. And it was the first time that I had realized there was such a club doing this kind of exegetical writing about the Sherlock Holmes stories, and it just brought my enthusiasm back up, and I got into it and into the BSI after several years, and have never looked back.
Well, what are the Baker Street Irregulars? You kind of indicated a little bit about them, that they, you guys, kind of enjoy looking at the Holmes canon as if it's in historical documents. But what does this group do? Who is it? What all do you do?
Well, the Baker Street Irregulars was a collection of writers, mostly, and some professional men in New York City in 1934 that were inspired and led by a writer and editor named Christopher Morley. And this was actually, I guess the word would be concocted or possibly marinated in the back room of a speakeasy on East 45th Street during the final years of Prohibition. It was very much, ever since, basically a speakeasy atmosphere in nature. And it has a constitution and bylaws published in February 1934, right after Prohibition had ended, so people could drink in public again, which bylaws is spelled B-U-Y, and they have to do largely with who buys the next round of drinks. And over the years, it has accumulated a great many people from the arts and letters and from professional life who have this kind of intense interest in both the Sherlock Holmes stories and in playing games with them. And a lot of them are not people that your listeners would have heard of, but quite a few were, including Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who was a contributing honorary member during the 1940s before his death.
Well,
but
so
many other writers would be well known. For example, the science fiction writer Isaac Asimov was a very active Baker Street Irregular.
And is this just strictly an American organization for the most part?
It has a certain percentage of foreign members as well. There's most of them come from English-speaking countries. Quite a few from Canada, where there's a lot of proximity to the annual Baker Street Irregulars weekend in New York every January, and in England as well. But there's a fair sprinkling of members from other European countries, and also some from Japan, where there is a great interest in the Sherlock Holmes stories.
Well, one of the things that you became involved with was historian for the group, and that kind of led to your first book, where you looked at Conan Doyle's letters, isn't that right?
Yeah, that really has not so much to do with the BSI. I think I may be not unique, but certainly in a very small minority of irregulars who have a very big interest in Arthur Conan Doyle. Generally speaking, in the BSI, his traditional role has been that of literary agent for Dr. Watson, and not the best of all literary agents at that. But there are some of us who have a strong interest in him, and another member and I, the other member is author of an award-winning Conan Doyle biography, Daniel Stashower is his name. We're able to produce this annotated edition of Conan Doyle's family correspondence, and certainly was a fascinating project for us, and it's published in both the United States and Britain so far. There are currently, of all things, both Chinese and Japanese translations being prepared. And there are some surprises even for people who thought they knew Conan Doyle well out of the letters in this book. Certainly there were for us as well.
What?
Well, for one thing, that the first Sherlock Holmes tale was a novella called A Study in Scarlet that was published in the Beaton's Christmas Annual for 1887, and not really much noticed by anybody. He was commissioned a couple of years later to write a second one, another novella called The Sign of the Four, and it, like the first one, it disappeared without too much notice as well at the time. Then about 3 years later, he decided to give the protagonist of these two failed novellas a new chance in short story form, and they began to appear in July of 1891 in a new magazine in England called the Strand Magazine, and they were an overnight sensation. Sherlock Holmes was suddenly a household word in not only the English-speaking world, but in other countries as well. And no one had been quite sure why he gave Sherlock Holmes a final chance in these short stories. And it turned out, and we found from his letters, that in the depths of his belief around 1890 that these stories had been failures, he had a letter from one of the most celebrated physicians in Britain, who was writing not only for himself, but from one of the most celebrated jurists in Britain, the Chief High Justice of Great Britain, how much they had liked those two novellas about this Sherlock Holmes and how they happened to read more by him. And it probably is the single most important factor for keeping the character alive in this new short story form in 1891. Without that letter from these two men that just clearly, from his account of it to his mother, blew him away, he probably would never have returned to Sherlock Holmes.
Well, how did it come about that you became the literary executor for the Conan Doyle family in the States?
Well, in the mid-1970s, I was co-editing a quarterly journal. A new biography of Conan Doyle had come out. I had somebody review it. somebody in Britain saw the review and knew his surviving daughter named Jean Conan Doyle, who at the time was a retired Royal Air Force general, and showed it to her. And she had a somewhat different view of the biography in question, and one day a letter showed up from her, about 2 pages worth of her view of the biography and why she was not so enthusiastic about it as the reviewer had been. And I basically said, this is good enough to run as it is, as an article, if that's all right with you. And it was. She was glad to have that happen. And it led to a long correspondence with her, and meeting her for the first time in London about a year after that. And this was all happening at the time that U.S. copyright law was changing, and it made her the one person in the world eligible to recapture all of her father's U.S. copyrights for what was going to be, under the new law, an extended period of protection. So we basically got her a copyright lawyer to perform the requirements under the new law and to create a system to exercise her rights in the United States. And we basically kept this within the BSI family because her biggest concern was not income from the stories and characters, but what you would call quality control. Mm-hmm. And so it required saying no a lot to people who wanted to use the characters themselves, which is not something that's close to the heart of a literary agent, because he gets 10 or 15% of when he says yes, and he gets 0 when he says no to somebody. But she wanted to say no to a good deal, and just went on from there. She died in 1997. The estate is now a small number of her beneficiaries, members of the family, and I think this will be continuing to roll along for quite a long time to come.
What sort of projects did she and the family say yes to? What kinds of proposals do they like? What kinds of things don't they like?
Jean had, when it came to new Sherlock Holmes stories by other people, kind of a unenthusiastic attitude, but she realized the power of the characters and went along with a lot. She did have, because of her background, her long service in the Royal Air Force, she had once been an aide-de-camp to the Queen, some standards that she wanted observed. She did not want the royal family to be characters in any new Sherlock Holmes novel by other people. Her father had never done that. She didn't want to be authorizing other people to do that. That was one thing. In the stories, in some of the stories, I should say, Sherlock Holmes used cocaine in periods where he had no work and was very bored. She did not want this expunged from anything new, but she didn't want it becoming the central issue either, because she didn't want drug use glamorized in any way, inadvertently. At the same time, she had a remarkable sense of humor. There's a wonderful movie called Without a Clue. It stars Michael Caine and Ben Kingsley, made back in the 80s, I think, early 80s, in which Watson is actually the only real one of the two, and he's the smart one, and he's the one who's solving the crimes, but nobody is taking him seriously in that role, and he hires a drunken actor played by Michael Caine to impersonate Sherlock Holmes, which is actually a figment of Watson's imagination. And this was actually done concocted by 2 writers in Hollywood. I think the 2 that were responsible for the TV series Barney Miller, speaking of detectives, over the bar of a cocktail lounge in Santa Monica one night, probably around the 3rd or 4th round. And they were sure that they were going to be, to get nowhere with this. But they sent it to me, and I read it, the script, And I said, well, I'm going to have to show this one to Jean, when we'll see what she says. And she read it, and her response was, my father would have loved the joke. And the movie was made, and this is still great fun for those who haven't seen it.
Do you have anything to do with the TV and film adaptations, or are you strictly literature?
No, we're involved in all media, and I licensed the use of the characters in the Warner Brothers movie, the one that came out already, and the sequel that is coming out in December, and the exhibition of the new BBC series Sherlock that was on PBS recently.
Yeah, I like that one a lot.
Yes,
I hope there's more. They've only made 3 so far that I know of.
There's a second series of 3 that has been ordered. I don't think they've been made yet, but there will be more. It's a very clever updating of the characters into contemporary London setting.
Well, you must have very strong opinions about some of the incarnations that have come out. I remember you telling me you weren't a big fan of the Jeremy Brett incarnation.
I thought the Jeremy Brett series was absolutely wonderful, except for Jeremy Brett.
Oh, dear.
Who I think is what the British call over the top in the way that he played Sherlock Holmes. But the stories, they use the original stories, which is nice to see. They had wonderful period detail in the production values. And the first Watson was so good that when he left the series, I thought, what are they ever going to do? And I thought the second Watson, if anything, was better. So it's certainly worth watching for anyone who hasn't. I don't go back to it that often.
Well, if you were going to pick some of the things that you think folks should see, what would be your favorite films and adaptations
of all time?
Yeah.
Well, I grew up on the Rathbone movies when they were being shown on television continuously.
Very controversial amongst Holmes fans.
Yeah, the first 2 from that were made in 1939, I think everybody likes because they had Victorian settings. The ones that are set in modern times, people have very different feelings about, but I think most everybody likes Rathbone a great deal as Sherlock Holmes. I think there is a wonderful depiction of the Holmes and Watson, and also Holmes's older, smarter brother, Mycroft Holmes, in a mid-60s British movie about Jack the Ripper called A Study in Terror, in which Mycroft Holmes is played by Robert Morley, who just seems created by nature for the role. But it's always interesting to see what the imagination of people in the entertainment industry come up with. In the new Warner Brothers movie that will be coming out in December, Mycroft Holmes will appear this time, and he's being played by Stephen Fry, which I think is a stroke of genius in casting. So I hate to pick too many of my own personal favorites publicly, because I think there's remarkably good work being done today, and will be in the foreseeable future. The British thriller writer Anthony Horowitz, who is the person behind Foyle's War and Midsummer Murders that have been on PBS in this country, is writing a new Sherlock Holmes movie. I'm sorry, not movie, but novel that will be published in the autumn. That we have licensed the use of the characters for and are looking forward to very eagerly. And I would be astonished if it does not become a movie as well, considering his activity in the television and movie industry.
Well, speaking of novels, we obviously need to spend some time talking about Baker Street Irregular. Now, it's not a Sherlock Holmes story, but it's based on, a lot of actual people that populate, I guess, times of the Great Depression and through World War II and up through McCarthyism. Without giving any spoilers, can you give kind of a synopsis of the book?
Well, the idea for it came in equal parts out of my work in the Baker Street Irregulars history as a club, which had been concentrating on the 1930s and 40s. and work I was actually doing at the same time at the Pentagon, where I was a policy and strategy officer in the Office of the Secretary of Defense. And it's basically, it takes a look at what happened to the club and its members in a very difficult stretch of time for the United States in its history, beginning in the years of the Depression, as you're suggesting, and then as it gets into the 40s, the rise of Nazism and other totalitarian philosophies abroad, the threat that posed to U.S. interests, and eventually the war that followed and America's participation in it. And many of the Baker Street Irregulars in those years were involved in those matters at the time. The person who wrote the Constitution and bylaws that I mentioned was, for example, the director of the Office of War Information for President Roosevelt during World War II, after a long career as a newsman. And I wanted to also get into the certain intelligence programs that we were brought into being by the United States government during the war, because not only did I find them tremendously interesting in my own researches for my own professional purposes at the Pentagon, they are programs that were sometimes immensely important, perhaps crucial to the outcome of the war. And yet, not only does the public not know much about them, even today, most current intelligence officers really don't know much about them. So it was a very attractive idea to me, and not terribly hard to do historically, to put the one fictional member of the BSI in the novel into those roles during the war. And I'm hoping that I have done it in a way that makes it very hard for people to sort out what is fictional in the novel and what is real, what is historical. It's very deeply researched in terms of the history of it. And if people cannot tell the difference between fiction and nonfiction in this novel, I will be very pleased.
Well, I think the research definitely shows, because of the depth of the tale and description starting right from the beginning, because the central character, Woody Hazelbacker, he starts off dealing with gangsters before he becomes involved with, going to D.C. and slowly becoming more and more involved with intelligence. One thing struck me as interesting is that the Baker Street Irregulars, each of them kind of represented different viewpoints about Nazism and U.S. involvement in the war, so you have a lot of different perspectives on history in there, don't you?
That's very true. The Baker Street Irregulars, because of their intense attachment to the Sherlock Holmes stories, all tended to be Anglophiles, and some of them actually were English in origin at the time. But their views on what their U.S. role in the world should be varied considerably. And while Christopher Morley, and the founder of the Baker Street Irregulars, was very much in favor of doing what we could to help Britain fight on against Hitler alone in 1940 and 41, his brother Felix, and both of them had been Rhodes Scholars in England at one time, his brother Felix was one of the leading spokesmen for isolationism in the United States. So it really put them on opposite sides of the political debate in America, which in 1940 and 41 was very fierce, about whether the United States should do what it could to help the Allies, and eventually only Britain after France went down, or whether we should stand aside from it and not get involved as we had in World War I.
And Mr. Hazelbacker is kind of like the rudder of the book, because not only do we have all this history swirling around him, he's got a interesting personal drama. Can we talk about that without giving any spoilers away?
Well, I think one way of putting it is that while women, as Sherlock Holmes once said, the women were Watson's department, they really aren't Woody's. He likes women a lot, he doesn't really have many successful outcomes in it, and so they become very complicating for him, both politically and personally, in the book, and in essence, tragically. I think he finds his romantic life and indeed his marriage very much a victim of the greater passions that are underway in the world about what is going on and what America should do about it.
And folks, if that sounds a bit oblique, remember this is a mystery story. And while there's a lot of espionage going on, there certainly are a lot of questions raised that really aren't answered till the very final paragraphs. So this was definitely a fun read for me. It's a very engaging book. I'd have to say it's a bit of a slow starter because it's kind of hard to know what the story is for a while. It takes a while to introduce Woody and get the setting and the background. And then it gets really cooking, and I couldn't put it down. It was one of those cover-to-cover reads for me. Folks, and that would be to go to www.audioentertainment.org and down to the Persons of Interest page, and then you'll find Jon Lellenberg and the information about this book. And it sounds to me, John, like we're going to talk about Sherlock Holmes again, especially when the next movie comes out and when that book comes out, because for me, Sherlock Holmes has been a boundless fountain of entertainment, well, for old-time radio dramas, all the TV and all the books and interpretations. So we've just scratched the surface here, haven't we?
That's very true. He goes on and on forever, and changes in time, era, culture, language don't really seem to have much effect upon it.
So, folks, if you're interested in Sherlock Holmes, keep an eye out for the upcoming projects, and absolutely check out Baker Street Irregular. So I guess at this point we should just simply say, hey, John, thanks a lot for appearing on Dave White Presents.